and gentlemen, and welcome to this 12th day of June. Well, it's a little bit cloudy and there's a little bit of shower, a little bit of drizzle out about here in Brisbane today. But at the moment, it is 13 degree and mostly cloudy. Well, let's get the news up to date today on this Monday morning. What do we have? Albanese government is going to review the multicultural policy. Here's what it means.
I think it's very much at a crossroads. For the last 25 years, we've let it unravel. And now the opportunity is there, which the government is trying to take, I think, to try and rebuild it. And rebuild it in ways that help the nation as a whole to go forward. I think when Al Grasby put the idea on the table for the first time 50 years ago, he was concerned about three issues, really. One was freedom, the second was equality, and the third was opportunity. And they're really the key words for contemporary Australian democracy. So that, in a sense, multiculturalism is the essence of Australian democracy, but we've let it sort of unravel a lot as public policy over the last generation.
Yeah, just expand
Sure.
on that for us. What does unravelling mean? What did you
the institutions that we put in place had a number of goals. One was to make sure we actually knew what was going on in the country about diversity so we could plan properly. So we had really important research institutions that did stuff, produced reports, not only that, but guided government. We had a lot of connection between the Department of Prime Minister, the Office of the Prime Minister, and ethnic communities around the country, so we could track that properly, and there was a lot of interaction around that. There was really good policy being made. And we also, I think, and this is important, were moving towards thinking about having national legislation like the Canadians have done, and indeed like most of Europe has, which actually puts some of these principles into law. Because we don't have that at the moment. It's very easy to change. Now, I think one of the number of consequences of that are, firstly, we do a lot of stuff on the basis of prejudice and anecdote rather than on the basis of knowledge and fact. We saw that during the pandemic. We had really bad stuff happening around what was happening with ethnic communities and cultural diversity. So all of those things are there. We're at a point where we've got good footings, but the structures above them are wobbly. Yeah. And that's where we really need to focus.
Yeah.
So how do you reinforce those structures? Where do you start with creating a policy for all Australians? I mean, does it essentially start with defining what Australia and what an Australian is?
Well, I think maybe rather than describing what modern Australia is, it's what sort of pathway do we want to open up for our people over the coming generations. I think that's really the question. I don't think there's a specific thing that we are. There are many ways of being Australian, and recognising that diversity is the first strength. Right, so you can be of any faith, you can be of any ethnic background, you can carry a heritage that goes back to the British, you can have a heritage that goes back 30, 40, 50,000 years into the First Nations. All of that contributes to what Australia is today, and the problem we've had, particularly over the last decade or so, but maybe even longer than that, we've been more, how can I put it, we've been quite anxious about conflict, and we've tended to suppress a lot of the autonomy and ideas that people have about themselves.
Yeah, because the term multicultural can be fraught with controversy. It does depend on how you approach the notion itself. And I think there are certain sensitivities, I suppose, that some people feel are not being addressed. And people feel, well, I don't belong because I am not seen to be part of this multicultural Australia.
Well, I think
how do you make it inclusive?
Well, I think that's the critical question. There is a danger in thinking of Australia as being made up of three peoples: First Nations, charter cultures, the British and so on, and the immigrant communities. I think that's a dangerous model because it does exactly what you're saying. It sets up boundaries between groups, whereas the real challenge for us is to develop as an intercultural nation as much as a multicultural one. So that people learn about each other, interact with each other. They don't lose the essence of who they want to be, but they recognise that they have a what would you call it, a shared responsibility for the well-being of the country. Right?
Yeah.
And I think one of Australia's great strengths has been that we have welcomed people from everywhere. And one of our great weaknesses has been we tend to drop the barrel at times of crisis. And so both of those things have to be addressed. We have to look to where our strengths are and how that works best, and we have to look at where we've made mistakes and how we can overcome those. That's what the review is about.
Yeah, you mentioned that we do have to wrap, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on, you mentioned that, you know, we welcome everyone, but we tend to welcome migrants, and many of those go on to temporary visas where you're afforded not the same privileges as others. I mean, is that one area that really needs to be looked at?
Well, I think the whole growth of the temporary migration thing is really critical, because one of the things that's happened there, well, first, you're right, you sit in limbo often, but also the infrastructure that we used to plan closely with all migration, we've dropped the ball a bit on that, because we think of people, hundreds of thousands of people, as temporary, but they still need resources, support, etc. And again, during the pandemic, we really did a nasty job on a lot of those temporary immigrants who'd been so important to the country. And we're seeing it again today. We desperately need new populations, right? As we age, we need new younger people coming in. We need them from everywhere. We need those skills. And in particular, we need the creativity that emerges from the interaction between all those groups.
So there you are, welcoming everyone into Australia, be it refugees or a business migrant, anyone, but everyone should be given the equal opportunity, equal treatment, and no one should be discriminated against. A time to look at the multicultural policy. Well, from time to time, all policies need to be reviewed. All policies need to be re-looked at. And even my personal belief is that in coming years, even the whole word multicultural will go, you know, right, he was talking about that there's three groups. There's the indigenous, then the first settlers, then all the migrants who are now termed as a multicultural community. Why can't there be a term for all of us? Simple as that. Why do you have to, have that distinction or discrimination, I could say? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's food for thought. Well, right now, let's go on to our next news. And rather sad news about that coach that overturned. And we've been told that it was being chartered or hired for a wedding.
Truly tragic news out of our community overnight. It's not something that anyone wants to wake up to, and our thoughts are just with the family and friends of those involved in the crash and the broader community, and also our thanks to the first responders on site who always do an amazing job. When were you first told about this crash? I saw overnight reports on social media of a crash in the site and didn't get further details till from New South Wales Police reporting till later on in the morning, where it tragically confirmed a number of people had died in the crash. And so, it's truly devastating. Yeah, and do you have any more details about where the bus was, what it was coming from, who may have been on the bus? We're still waiting for further details to come to light as the investigations can continue. We don't know the circumstances around the crash at the moment, but it does appear that it was a wedding chartered bus that had been coming from a wedding earlier that day. Okay, that's just terrible, terrible news. It is a region that's very popular with weddings because of all of the wineries there. Yes, that's right. We're a major tourist destination, and so I'm sure that there's been many people from across the country that have done similar things to this, and they'll, I'm sure, be sending their love and well wishes along to the people involved in this as well. Tell us about the area where it happened. Can you tell us about the condition of the road and also visibility? There's been some questions about that this morning. Yes, so the road itself is quite a large roundabout going over a major highway of the Hunter Expressway, but there does appear to have been a lot of fog around as well. But until we know the crash investigation circumstances, we're not really sure about what may have contributed to it.
Okay. As a council, are you doing anything?
At the moment, our job's to support the emergency services, and we'll be working with them and through the day looking at what other support's needed to be provided to the community.
Okay, and just back to what you said you understand, you believe that it may have been people coming from a wedding. Do you know if it's locals or if it's people from outside the area?
No, unfortunately, I haven't got any further details on that at this stage.
Have you been down to the crash site this morning? Can you tell us what it's looking like?
Not yet. I'm making my way there at the moment, so should have some more details later on this morning.
Just tell us about the community there where you are in Cessnock.
We are a close-knit community. We do come together in difficult circumstances, so I'm sure the community as a whole will be there and supporting the local residents around this and offering any support they can provide to emergency services.
Just in terms of what roads are closed at the morning, we understand that Wine Country Drive is closed in both directions in Branxton between the New England Highway and Bridge Street. Now, that shouldn't be impeding traffic on the New England Highway. You tell me if that geography is right. Tell me what you know.
Yes, that's right. So the New England Highway and the Hunter Expressway, to my knowledge, are both open, but Wine Country Drive around that area is closed. I encourage everyone to go onto the live traffic website and make sure they check for road closures, but I expect it to be closed for quite some time while investigations occur.
Okay, and do you know how many people are actually on the scene at the moment? First responders, ambulance, fire?
There were quite a number of emergency services there, from ambulances to the rescue helicopters. So there were a number of them as well, and transporting patients out to our major hospitals in Newcastle and down to Sydney as well.
Our heart goes out to the people who are affected. Such a tragic incident happening out there. Well, ladies and gentlemen, right now for my next three reports, we look at the housing sector. I know that this year we have in the last couple of months, we have been unable to bring to you the weekly real estate update with Umesh Chandra, but we will resume that as soon as we get back on track. For now, we'll look at these three reports, which are on housing, mainly to do with rentals. Let's take a look.
Leaving prison should be a relief, but for Eddie Atkinson, returning to the outside world was a scary prospect.
I come out a different person because I was so frightened of the world, whereas before I wasn't.
He was released from custody after serving 8 months on remand, with his charges later dropped. But Mr. Atkinson says with little help or support, it was extremely difficult to meet his basic needs, like finding somewhere to live.
All I got from the prison was a bus ticket to here.
His story isn't unique. Advocates say prison pushes people further into disadvantage and homelessness, and this has been made worse by the housing crunch around the country.
Housing organisations really don't want people who've been in prison. People are staying in prison for longer because there's no accommodation in the community, and particularly when they're first charged as well.
A record number of Australians are being locked up in jail, with the imprisonment rate rising 35% since the turn of the century. Part of that increase is because of the rising rate of reoffending. Around 60% of people in prison have a prior conviction. According to a 2021 Productivity Commission report, those reoffending rates could be reduced with improved access to housing and employment for incarcerated people once they leave jail. Advocates say nowhere near enough is being done to provide support for basic needs.
We are not investing in those things that have an evidence base, and we continue to invest in prison.
A lack of investment and support that advocates say is putting criminalised people at increased risk of finding themselves homeless or locked up in jail.
So there you are, you're getting released from the prison but having nowhere to go. What do you make of that? Well, as we know, I said our next three reports will be looking at housing. So what's the Greens' take on housing and the housing bill?
We've halved our offer to $2.5 billion a year invested every year starting now in public and affordable housing, and a $1 billion a year on the table to help incentivise the states and territories to introduce a freeze on rent increases. We still basically haven't seen any movement from Labor on our two key demands, which is more money for public and affordable housing and action to limit rent increases across the country. We've put on the table a freeze on rent increases because that's what many states and territories used during the pandemic in the middle of an emergency, which we're in right now. But our frustration is that Labor still don't seem to recognise the scale of the housing crisis right now, and certainly spending at most $500 million a year from next year, not even this year, not building a single home until after the federal election in 2025, and doing nothing for renters is not a response to the scale of the housing crisis right now, and certainly we're frustrated that Labor haven't recognised that.
Labor does really seem to be digging in over this rent control issue, and it is a state matter. You want them to coordinate it, put some incentives on. If they agree to increase the payout from the Future Fund, might you be willing to just let go of that rent control issue for the time being?
Well, look, we can't ignore 1/3 of the country who rents. I was door knocking over the weekend and I spoke to a pensioner whose rent had gone up over $200 last lease, and he said to me, if my rent goes up a single dollar after that, I'm probably going to be living on the streets. Now, there are millions of renters across this country now who are paying more than 30% of their income on rent. We need to do something on rents because it's not sustainable to have unlimited rent increases for the next few years when the RBA has even said that they expect rents to go up again over the next 12 months at least. Now, on the quantum of funding, of course, we're willing to negotiate on that. Let's be clear, we halved our offer from $5 billion a year for public and affordable housing to $2.5 billion. In the context of a budget that is locking in $30 billion a year on the stage 3 tax cuts and $12 billion a year in tax concessions for property investors, I would like to think that actually $2.5 billion is a relatively modest ask in the context, again, of one of the worst housing crises this country has ever seen.
Where does this end? Because Labor at this point in time has been pretty hard and fast. I mean, you do risk here. The Liberals are opposed. They're opposed for different reasons. They say it's too much. You say it doesn't go far enough. If Labor isn't willing to move, are you willing as Greens to be risked being called wreckers over this?
Well, the only wreckers of the housing market and the housing crisis right now are the Labor Party. We have a downturn in the private construction industry, freeing up the skills and construction materials we could use to build more public and affordable housing. We have a progressive Senate ready to pass a plan that actually starts to tackle the scale of the crisis. And we have broad popular support for the demands that the Greens are making right now. There is no technical or political barrier right now to investing $2.5 billion a year in public and affordable housing and coordinating a national freeze on rent increases, or at the very least, national caps on rent increases. It is beggars' belief that we are having to fight this hard to convince the Labor Party that we should be taking substantial action on the housing crisis. I think it isn't right to suggest that because the Greens are trying to negotiate, including halve our offer, while you have the Labor Party refusing to budge on our two key demands, somehow framing the Greens as the one standing in the way of dealing with the housing crisis. It's abundantly clear that the Labor Party have decided it's their way or the highway on our two key issues. And their way is hundreds of thousands of more people waiting for social and affordable housing, millions of renters falling into financial stress or being evicted because they can't afford the rent in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. I'm sure a lot of your listeners this morning would hate to think that the federal government's best response to the housing crisis is a $10 billion gamble on the stock market and not building a single home until after the next election in 2025. That's not how a country like Australia should handle one of its greatest social challenges right now, which is a massive housing crisis.
Well, he did have some points there, but I mean, looking at those rent freezes and things like that, and by the same time, then other things need to be put on freeze as well, like the interest rate, other costs as well. So there are, when you look at the renters, there's a market out there, meaning there's all these properties which have been supplied by investors. So they have put their investment in line to provide a home for people. And they have a mortgage on that as well, and they have to service that loan as well, dealing with all the RTA laws and all the rental the tenancies agreements and all those kind of things as well. And on top of that, if they have a rental freeze as well, it doesn't make it very desirable for people to come and invest, which will mean less people will be investing in investment properties, or it will also create an even bigger shortage. So there's food for thought. I mean, look, it's not that they increase the rent just for the sake of it. It's the economics, supply and demand, plus also making the ends meet, making the budget meet. If the interest rate goes anything, so it's a vicious cycle. If something goes up, next thing will eventually go up. You can't just increase one and not expect others to go. So there's wages rise, there's the interest rates that have gone on, labor cost, cost of doing business has increased. So eventually someone has to pay along the line somewhere. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned, that this segment we're looking at all of these things to do with rentals. Right now we look at this last report where we talk about sharing that burden. How do we share the burden so that it's evenly distributed?
Olivia has been living in her rental property in Launceston for about a year, and the rent has just gone up.
We kind of panicked when we moved in there because we knew that the renting sitch was a bit hectic.
She says there wasn't a lot of choice.
When we were looking for this one, we had a look at a few places around and they were dire. It was pretty bad, so we got the best of a bad bunch.
Let's say you're looking to live on your own in Hobart. Tasmania's average weekly income is $700. A quick search of real estate shows there are just 15 properties for rent across Greater Hobart for under $300 a week, some of which are up to 32 kilometres away. That search also includes properties like this one. They're offering a room in an 8-bedroom house for $280 a week. The rooms are also pitched as dual occupancy, meaning the house could host up to 16 people.
In many cases, tenants are having to share rooms to stay with their parents or to live in substandard housing.
The owner of the house says the rooms were originally aimed at students. Having more people per house is something the Reserve Bank Governor has been encouraging.
We need more people on average to live in each dwelling.
Plenty of young Australians are already living in share houses, and it can still bring with it financial challenges.
Every 6 months when we'd re-sign the lease, they'd put the prices up like $50.
Lately, I've been working in holidays, and then during semester, what I'm earning is less than what my rent is.
I was sharing an apartment before with just like a mate, and then our rent went through the roof, so I moved to a bigger share house.
Housing's alright. I don't think that, just having access to a room is really good enough. Like, people should be able to find housing and homes that are comfortable for them.
Lucy MacDonald, ABC News.
Yes, as per my original comment, that, providing a good home with all the facilities in it, making it all beautiful, does come at a cost. So, those costs need to be covered. Though you can't expect landlords to provide, a very, very nice homes and not charge for it, because it is the economics of the things. And we know many of these investors are mom and dad investors. They're not big time corporate investors, but they have put a lot online to get a mortgage, to get into a investment property market. And some of them have 1 or 2 investment properties which provides for the housing for people. So, but as housing is the basic in human needs, and it's a human right. But, of course, when the investors are providing the property, they will need a return on the investment. And hence, if everything else around them goes up, they will eventually have to put the rent up to, stay in the market. Well, ladies and gentlemen, right now moving on, Let's go to the last news for today before we go to our functions and events, is the teacher shortage in this country.
When Keely McGregor saw a job ad for a teaching role in Melbourne, she jumped at the chance.
When the opportunity arose, I thought this is perfect, great opportunity to teach and get some travel in.
The Canadian is the first teacher recruited from abroad to this Broadmeadow school. As a specialist school, it has long faced additional staffing challenges.
There's a belief that teachers need to have a special education qualification. Things are changing in that space now.
The school is now using social media, contacting past teachers and looking overseas for new teachers.
When we get staff to come and they answer the ads and they're on board, we often get that culture of, I'm not leaving. I love this environment, I love working, I love to see the students develop and grow.
But finding new teachers is challenging.
Across Victoria, there are more than 1,100 teaching roles being advertised. That's up from 900 vacancies at the start of the year. That shortage means some schools are posting job ads, but not receiving a single application.
Well, we simply don't have the supply of teachers across the state that we need, whether that's just purely in numbers or whether it's the specialist areas.
Victoria's Education Minister, Natalie Hutchins, says the state support for the education system saw an extra 5,000 teachers registered between 2020 and last year. But even with that boost, schools are still struggling to find enough teachers for their classes. Elise Kinsella, ABC News, Melbourne.
So there you are. That is something we discussed earlier on last week, I think, about the labour shortage in Australia. And there we go. One of the fields, one of the areas identified is the teachers, and that teachers are needed into the community, and there is a shortage, and there's 1,100 jobs been put out there, and no applications are coming through, or very few applications are coming through. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It's been wonderful having your company as usual. I hope you had a very good weekend. Mine was, as usual, very, very busy, so many functions. We will bring to you some of the glimpses in the coming shows during the week, so that, we might bring to you tomorrow maybe the glimpses of the citizenship ceremony which took place at the Islamic College of Brisbane. Until tomorrow, it's goodbye from us. But before that, let's take a look at some of the functions and events taking place. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there you are, up to date. And my apologies, those some of the events there might not be the correct one. So we will look at the updated one from tomorrow. So, ladies and gentlemen, right now it's saying goodbye until tomorrow. And my apologies for that. And we'll take a look at the updated functions and events from tomorrow.